sometimes you choose a path that you think works for you. And that is why when you're given a topic, you kind of want to work through it the best way you can. And so when I was given this topic, feminisms and gender equality, and I asked myself, is there something that would say this is an African feminism? And what is it that would be the characteristics of that feminism? So that was my starting point. And I kind of really haggled around this because as best as I know, it's difficult to talk about a unified African feminism or even feminisms. And every scholar seems to come up with their own naming. And so, you're dealing with lots of ideas, some that have taken root, others that never took root, and others you don't even agree with yourself. There are things you look at and you say, no, this one is not a serious one. But it's their view and it's out there. So generally, my outline is what we have here. I look at the meaning of feminism in general, and then ask whether there are any distinctly African variants of feminisms, and then look at a specific aspect. Because I ask myself, what really makes African feminisms or feminism African? So I went for, like the connection between feminisms and African culture. So that's what really informs the presentation that I'm going to do. Then I'll talk briefly about feminisms and gender equality, about women in African feminism, and touch a bit about men. And then finally, I just want to look at some of the problems and that we are faced in terms of essentializing African feminisms. So, by way of definitions, I think that scholars have written so much about feminisms, and they have argued that really what makes a strand of feminism African is that it's going to be attuned or aligned to the needs and concerns of African women. So the question is there anything that we can say this is distinctly a concern for African women? And of course, I'm sure you can be sure what answer there is to that. It's as good as mine. There is nothing like this is strictly an African woman's concern, which is different from other women's concerns. But then again, we want to look at the arguments that have been put across, particularly around African culture and traditions. So these African culture and traditions happen to be like a double-edged sword. Amongst the Maasai of Kenya, they carry a sword, and this sword cuts both sides. So you turn it this way, it can cut. You turn it that way, it cuts. So tradition and culture is both emancipatory as well as oppressive. So it depends on how you are looking at it, what aspects of culture you are using, and how you are using them. And for me, that is one of the things I would say is key to African feminisms or feminism, whatever it is that we want to say. So, so many of the accounts of feminisms that we have in African societies. Now, I need to place this computer in such a way that I can read it and you guys can watch the screen. I don't know how to do this.
you have a longer cable, so you can put it up there.
I can put it up here. Oh, thank you. Thank you for saving me. No thinking. Okay, so yeah, that makes it good for all of us. Okay, so that is where, that is how I thought about this presentation. Now, one of the things that I also want to underline, sorry about that, is that there are many definitions of African feminism in general. But some of my best definitions are those that are open-ended. You know, open-ended in the sense of you can even add in your own words or interpret them in specific ways that speak to you. Those are my best definitions. And one of these is Bell Hooks 2000, who says, feminism is a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation and oppression. So you can add in Africa, in Kenya, in Ghana, and you can even add the type of oppression that you think. And then my very best, because my background is religious studies, my very best is Elizabeth Fiorenza. She says, feminism is the radical notion that women are people. And she says, and she uses a lot of biblical imagery. And she says, look, women are not temptresses. You know, like the story of Eve, who tempted Adam, and then sin comes into the world. So she says women are not temptresses. Women are not even harlots. They're not, you know, because the Bible has all these women, some of whom are prostitutes, harlots, you know, some are possessed, and they don't even have names. So she says women are not all those things, but they are really people. But more importantly, that feminism is also influenced by race, class, gender, culture, amongst many other historical factors, including colonization, neo-colonization, and you know, the list is so endless. Slavery, I don't know, so many factors. So it is so important that when we are looking at feminisms or feminism in Africa, I don't know, we can use plural or singular, depending on what your line of thought is. When we are looking at all these, we must also be alive to the history of our countries, the kind of, you know, the kind of factors that have influenced livelihoods in those countries. I'm not an historian, so that is one area I know I am not good. So those questions you are asking, not me, I cannot answer them. So the connection between feminism and culture, I have already talked about that. That is so important. And depending on what part of Africa one is at or talking about, the issues may be different. Even what one has to deal with as a feminist organization or individual can be different. So the situation in Ghana, the situation in Kenya, there could be similarities, but also differences. What are these? Now, I've only concluded by saying that let's be keen that we do not even essentialize feminism. There is nothing like that. Feminism is not monolithic, women are not monolithic, so their issues are not generalizable. We have to look at all this and embrace all. But what are the key arguments that about African feminisms? Number one, African culture is one of the elements that has been used to create obstacles against gender equality. So many of the feminists that you read about would have an element or two or three on African culture. And how they choose what they talk about is very different, depends on who they are in terms of the disciplines. So if they are linguists, then they would choose that as the line of thought. If they are religious studies background, if they are historians, then they choose that to inform their argument. But most importantly, I want to say that culture is the mother of attitudes and stereotyping. And in my country, when somebody says, oh, that's our culture, we can't touch that, they just mean you should swallow that thing whole, however bad it is. But we have known that culture is also very dynamic. It changes and aligns itself to the changing situation. So there is nothing anybody would say that this is African culture and it cannot change. That doesn't exist. These days it's very easy. When somebody says, but that's our culture and our culture is important, we can't leave it. I always ask, how come you have embraced the mobile phone so quickly? Is it African? The last time I checked, that gadget is not made in Africa. It doesn't even have anything African on it, but we've embraced it so well, and we cannot do without it. Even my grandmother at 90-something would tell me, I want you to buy me a smartphone so that I can take photos and do the things you do on the phone, like scroll up and all that. So, why do we embrace mobile phone, which is new? It's nothing to do with our culture, but then we want to reject any transformations, changes within what we believe is our culture that would be empowering. We reject them and we say, no, this is not ours, it's not our culture. So language is an important carrier of all those attitudes and practices. So we kind of teach ourselves to listen to the language of African proverbs, the language of stories that are told in African communities, the language of sayings, the language of riddles. That is so important. But for me, it's important to be critical, So what really should inform African feminisms is our critique of African culture. And the aim of those critiques ought to be to establish what is disempowering, empowering, as well as the social structures that could be employed for gender equality, because they exist. When we search well enough, they are there. Now let's now think in terms of African culture, feminism, and gender equality. Now, so on one end, we have traditions, customs, attitudes, and behavior of the people of Africa. Now, it's important to underline that in one way or another, you find this informing government and how government operates, the judicial system. By the way, there's a time we had, embraced customary laws, and these were entrenched in our constitutions, so that if, let's say, there was divorce, there was a case where one needs to divorce the other, the court would ask for elders from within a certain community to come to court, and they begin analyzing your situation. So the judge just sits there and listens, and he would ask questions like, so was there a marriage? And these guys have to discuss and agree that according to this customary practice, a marriage only happens if maybe cows were paid. Or if not palm wine. In my community, there is something called buza. This is a traditional alcoholic beverage. And when a woman is getting married, a girl is getting married, one of the things that would have to be served is this alcohol. So for an outsider, you would look at it and say, she was given away for just a bit of alcohol. No, the alcohol is just symbolism, that there has been an agreement, that a marriage is going to be there. You see? So you can look at it negatively, but you can also dig into the deeper meaning of that alcohol. And then of course now the judge would simply be recording, there was a marriage because cows were given, there was this ceremony where alcohol was drunk, etc., etc. Then they would come back and ask, so what happened? If we have to end this marriage, what needs to happen? And some would say, she's given birth. So you cannot claim all the cows. She has given birth. And these children, if it's a patriarchal community, these children then belong to the man's family. So this woman is supposed to just go away, because the marriage is ended. And if it's matriarchal, then that is a different case altogether. Now, so culture is a key element, a backbone of, or the social fabric of what we would call African feminisms. It's so important to think about African culture. It, however, creates obstacles against the feminist agenda. And so we have to kind of navigate this culture thing very carefully. Culture has also been used to discriminate against women and to institute other forms of oppression of women. If we look at the cultural practices, and there are so many of them, we begin to see how this has happened. Now, I want to introduce the work of, one of the oldest women movements in Kenya. It is, it has a Kiswahili name, Maendeleo ya Wanawake, meaning, what's Maendeleo ya Wanawake? Freedom. Women development. And it was formed way back in 1952. But because you're an historian, this is interesting. Women movement was actually formed in order to help sideline the women from claiming positions of leadership in the early 1950s and 60s. So the women were told, you know what, you have to wait. Us men will take up this leadership first, but you organize, and then when we have taken over the leadership of this country, we can bring you in. And so women, Maendeleo ya Wanawake, however, grew to become a very powerful grassroots women's movement. Anywhere you go in Kenya, Maendeleo ya Wanawake is present. And as a woman who wants to vie for a political position, for example, if you do not go through Maendeleo ya Wanawake, you're dead. Because they have to they have the networks to support women. One of the earliest things that Maendeleo ya Wanawake did was to start interrogating African culture. And initially, now they joined hands with the early missionaries who were criticizing several aspects of African culture, from female genital mutilation to early marriages and all that. So they began by unearthing cultural practices that they said are life-threatening or oppressive or contribute to women's disempowerment. And they achieved this through advocacy and lobbying for enactment of relevant legislation. It didn't happen immediately, by the way, because some of these legislations came, were passed very recently, yet the women's movement had been saying it over and over again. Like the anti-female genital mutilation, it took from the 60s to 2011 for the legislation to be passed. And even after it's passed, female genital mutilation continues, Now, the other thing they did was that they have been agitating for affirmative actions in favor of women's representation in the legislature. For example, towards the 2010, the drafting of the 2010 Kenyan Constitution, maendeleo ya wanawake had a heavy representation. And that's how the quotas they got were negotiated. So it's been a very good organization to the extent that it's negotiated for that. Don't worry, sometimes, depending on the leadership, maendeleo ya wanawake also worked against the interests of the women. And I remember one woman who was heading the organization, I think it was around 2012, 2013, and she said, a woman cannot sit on a man's stool. As simple as that. And what she meant is, there is no way a woman is going to vie against a man for an important position like the presidency. Because then it means she's going to sit on a man's stool. And in some cultures, that's a serious abomination. How do you, as a woman, sit on a man's stool? But I also want to say that it's not just maendeleo ya wanawake that has continued contributing to this feminist agenda. There have also been lots of activism from individual women and NGOs that have been behind organizing demonstrations, issuing statements, etc., on matters of concern to them. I want to mention Wangari Maathai. Does that name sound familiar?
Greenbelt movement?
Yes, Greenbelt movement. Professor Wangari Maathai was not just about the environment. She was also about good governance. She was also about ensuring that the voice of the woman is heard. Actually, it is her who was told a woman cannot sit where? On a man's stool. That is disrespectful. And much of what she did was really feminism, but what strand of feminism? It was ecofeminism, and the insistence that really there is a connection between the environment, leadership, and cultures of peace. And she insisted that these three have to be together if there's going to be any development. And despite the fact that she's recognized internationally, at the time, she was thrown into the cells, as women threw stones at her and wondered what's wrong with her. Why isn't she able to concentrate on the things that she's supposed to concentrate on and all that? But she made a statement. And by the time she was dying, it's when now people have begun realizing how important what she said was. And there is this forest in Nairobi, it's called Karura Forest. If she didn't fight for it, we wouldn't have a place to walk in. And climate change would have impacted on us very, very negatively. Now, there have also been individuals and NGOs organizing around issues of gender-based violence and in its many forms, from sexual violence, verbal, political, etc. Actually, towards every general election, you're going to see NGOs coming together and saying, let us monitor these elections. Let us make sure that we are going to record each and every form of gender-based violence that is going to happen. Because we cannot be talking about independence and also oppressing women at the same time. Now, the other thing I want to mention is the introduction of women and gender studies in higher education. And for me, this has been a big deal. I think when I was writing my PhD, which was really about the inclusion of women's theology in the curriculums of higher education, I noted that at the time, we had all sorts of voices, some saying feminism and feminist theology is Western, we don't need it, there is no space for it. But we also had lots of individuals, some of whom were our mentors, who said, you know what, you can learn this within this other course and write on it, and it's okay. And it is the efforts of these individual women that introduced feminism and gender studies in our institutions. And I think that we cannot literally talk feminism without taking into account the efforts of such women. In Kenyatta University, I read very interesting stories about a woman historian. She was Theodora Ayot, who, when she wanted to introduce a course called Women in History, she was told by some men professors, that is rubbish. What is done about women in history? Don't we already know everything about them? You know, that's what she was told. But it's documented. She insisted until such courses were introduced, amongst others. So I want to, just mention also that one of the things that has really happened is that, to understand feminism and the feminist movement, you have to bring together all these pieces. This is academia, activism by NGOs, and the women's movement and all that. And all these things then begin to add up to why so many strands, why so many positions being taken in the struggle to end oppression of women. Good. With that then, I will do some of the successes and challenges. One of the successes I see is African feminist theorization and knowledge production has been ongoing. We don't have anything like some form of barrenness in that area. If you checked around, you begin to see, hey, there are so many theorizations and conceptualizations from Obioma Nameka's Nego-feminism, where she says feminism in African societies, in Africa, should be about negotiations. Because if you go fighting with a hammer, you don't get anywhere. Actually, many cultures have a saying, if you cannot go through the mountain, you simply go around it, and you are still able to get where you're supposed to be. Now, there has been a lot of progress noted in political, economic, and social and cultural spheres. And then African feminism has, however, become captive of the neo-liberal development industry. Particularly when we begin to bring in, the kinds of conversations around contemporary gender and development discourse. The gender mainstreaming for me has stolen, that sharp cutting edge that feminism provides. So now we are just there. We are saying, oh, we cannot go with women alone. Oh, we have to bring men along. Oh, women have issues, but men also have issues. So we are kind of watering down the feminist agenda. We've watered it down using this gender mainstreaming approach. And for me, the last time I checked, we've done gender mainstreaming for how long? At least I've earned from it a bit, participatory gender mainstreaming, doing this and that, since 2000, 2006, around there. But why haven't we managed to mainstream gender anyway? It is just in some shelves. Like if you went to some organizations, you ask them, oh, are you doing gender mainstreaming? They'll tell you yes. And what they mean is they hired a consultant to develop a gender mainstreaming policy, which is where? On the shelf. But on the ground, there's nothing. Life continues as normal. So feminism continues to be considered foreign by a large majority. And when somebody says, oh, she's a feminist, it means, hey, this is a woman, a man-hater. Maybe she's not even married. Does she even have kids? She's doesn't respect men and all that. Yet, feminist methods and approaches have been employed to bring about change in favor of women. So as much as it's a dirty word on one end, we know it is the same feminist approaches that have been utilized to bring about the changes that exist. And so there are so many continuities, discontinuities, diversities, and even vibrancy, and even tense relations in what we are calling feminisms or feminism in Africa. So it's not one and the same thing. And so I just want to end by saying gender really should be seen as a relational concept. I think I want to go with Obioma Nameka and be able to talk about negofeminism and say, well, there is a way in which if we are going to end oppression, and various forms of discrimination, it may take quite a bit of negotiating in some spaces. And there are many African proverbs that kind of point to this. The first is amongst my people, the Kisi Ekegusi saying, which says, that is like saying, if you lost a coin on the upper path of, on the upper side of the path, please don't just go on that upper side checking for it. Just check. It could have tossed itself to the lower side. And my people use that to simply insist on, you cannot follow the same path all the time if it's not giving you the solutions you're looking for. So, as a scholar of feminism, that for me means that you, as a feminist, you cannot use the same approach. If this is not working, then please change tact so that at the end of the day, we can have the emancipation that we are thinking about, that we are looking for. And for me, that's bright. And the second one, I think I have read about this, it's also Ghanaian. A river never forgets, a river which forgets its source will soon dry out. So there's the variants of that are like a river will not go back to its source. If it's following the natural course, it will flow from the top of the hill, to the lake or to the ocean or something like that, and never the reverse. So this for me implies that indeed the feminist movement already took off. We are not going back. So all we can do is we have to chart different ways forward. Whether we are going to go around rocks and mountains or under, it's got to be done. And the approaches would be many. And then, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And for me, this gathering is about going together so that we can get further and further in terms of working towards the EQUIP project, whose agenda is gender equality in higher education. And finally, a home without daughters is like a river without a source. So as I look at this room, I see so many daughters, and I know in my heart that indeed this is a rich source of knowledge, a rich source of all these strategies that we are going to employ to reach our destination. Thank you.
Thank you.